Well, hello everyone. My name is Scott Creps, and today I am with you to talk about ministering to youth. This is the second time I've gotten to be part of the CB Matrix training, and I'm really excited for our time together today. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. And I know I had a lot of fun last time. Right before we jump in, I just want to say a few things about me. I'm a pastor at Alpine Church. We're a church in northern Utah. We're a multi-site church. So we have 7 different locations. We have 5 English-speaking locations, 2 Spanish-speaking locations, and my role right now is different than last time I did this. My role now is the executive lead pastor of the church, and so I oversee a lot of the day-to-day operations of the church. I still oversee youth a bit, but a little bit more of a distance than I did in the past. I also just wanted to say that this CB Matrix training has just been a real blessing to our church. Last session we had a number of people from our church go through it, and it's just great to see them continue to flourish in ministry and to grow. And we have people right now who are also going through the training, and so I'm just really excited for this whole process, this whole 2-year process that you're all going through. I think it's fantastic. And anyway, today we're going to talk about ministering to youth, and way back when I was in youth group as a student, and I was part of it from the inside, and then I've led junior high youth, high school youth, and then combined junior high and high school youth. And my goal today is to really just talk about what I think is sort of the most important part of youth ministry, what's central to youth ministry, what really is going to make youth ministry succeed. And a lot of what we're going to talk about is I'm going to apply it to youth ministry, but it'll apply well to working with young adults or working with even any adults really, and some of the big biblical principles that we're going to talk about today. But to start off, I want you to think about a mentor that you've had in your life. I want you to think about somebody in your life who served as a mentor. When I think about mentors in my life, as I was thinking about that this week, one of the people that just popped into my head was this guy named Ed, and was my baseball coach for a lot of years. He was my baseball coach kind of through the end of my elementary school into early teenage years, and a lot of stuff about baseball. He taught me how to stay down on a ground ball, which I did not know how to do before he started to coach me in how to do that. He taught me how to and get hit by a pitch to get on base if we really needed it, because I was not the best hitter. So he wanted me to contribute anyway. He gave me a nickname that I cool at the time. And he helped me learn how to play baseball, and he helped me learn how to play baseball the right way. And as I got older, I've coached my kids in baseball. I've coached other kids in baseball, and I've passed on the skills that I learned from Ed. And lost touch with him, but he's a real mentor in my life, in a pretty important part of my life when I was a kid. I also thought of Keith, and Keith was one of my pastors growing up, and Keith was a mentor for me in a lot of ways. He's the one that really taught me about how to be passionate for Jesus. He really showed me what a passionate relationship looks like. And Keith always challenged me to be authentic in my pursuit of God. He taught me how important it was to love God and love people. And even to this day, I look at Keith as an example of love and compassion. Certainly Jesus is number one in terms of an example of love and compassion, but Keith really showed me how to live as a Christian in that way. So I want you to think about mentors in your life. I could talk about a lot of people who mentored me, especially when I was younger, but even still today. But I could talk about a lot of people who mentored me in my life and the impact. I want you to think about mentors you've had. Maybe think of mentors, not necessarily spiritual mentors, maybe mentors at work, maybe teachers who are mentors. Maybe you had a teacher who was real encouraging to you, or just, said you did really well on this essay. Maybe you should go in the direction of writing, or you really have a knack for science, and maybe you followed that mentor's advice. Or somebody at work, maybe it was your boss, maybe it was just somebody who had a little bit more experience, who really showed you the ropes at work and really inspired you. I certainly hope you've had mentors like that. And I hope you've had spiritual mentors. Think of people in your life who've served as spiritual mentors. I really hope that mom and dad were spiritual mentors for you, although probably not the case for a lot of people, a lot of us. But I want you to think of people who are spiritual mentors, maybe the person that you would say was your pastor in a very formative stage of your life, or maybe it was the person who led you to faith. But mentors play a key role in our lives, and mentoring is really important as we talk about youth ministry. I'm going to use the terms disciple making and mentoring a little bit interchangeably throughout our time today, just because mentoring tends to be an easier concept for people to grasp. But I've even been thinking, just this morning I was thinking about some of the people that I've mentored. I've been at our church long enough, and our church has now been around long enough that we've had young men who were students in youth ministry who are now staff at our church, which makes me feel old, because I remember when they were kids, and now they have they have a cubicle next to me, and so that's kind of crazy. But I just see how they were mentored and how they grew up in our church, and even a guy who was in a CB Matrix cohort in the last term or last session, who graduated from that, somebody that I helped lead the faith. I be part of the process of him being baptized, and now he's just growing in ministry, and it's exciting to see. And so I want you to think about people that you've mentored and the impact that God's allowed you to make on their lives. Because really, mentoring, discipleship, that gets at the heart of what I think youth ministry is all about. Just to give away pretty much all my sessions in one statement, that at the heart of it is disciple making. Now, before we really jump in here, because this first session is going to be called "What is the Goal of Youth Ministry?" I want to make this observation that youth ministry tends to be an afterthought in our church. For most churches, based on most churches that I've talked with, pastors that I talk with, elders that I talk with, for a lot of churches, youth ministry is an afterthought. It seems that most churches know that they need a youth ministry. They know they need a good youth group, because if you're a pastor or a church leader, you probably have that experience that if you don't have a youth group, churches or people might leave your church once their kids are that age, because they're like, hey, there's no youth group here, my kids need more. So we know that we need youth ministry, and we know that we need to provide something for our junior high and senior high students, but we often don't exactly really know what that is. If your church has some funds, you might hire a youth pastor, maybe part-time, maybe full-time. A lot of people get started in ministry, but often I find that the youth pastor isn't in a clear direction from the church about what they're supposed to do. It's sort of like they're hired and they're like, hey, you're the youth pastor, you figure it out, right? That's why we pay you, because you're the youth pastor. And so a lot of churches, they just sort of hire this position, or they appoint someone to be the youth pastor, but they don't give them a clear direction of how youth ministry fits into the overall framework of the church. And most pastors, they're motivated with a good heart. They want to serve Jesus, want to honor him, but because they receive little direction from the church, I think it creates all kinds of problems. I mean, that's one of the reasons that the youth pastor role has such high turnover. Studies show that probably the youth pastor role has the highest turnover of any role in the church. And I think part of the reason is because there's not this clear connection with the main church and with youth ministry. And so when we don't know what we're trying to do in ministry, just like in all of life, we get more frustrated. And I think that happens to a lot of pastors, youth leaders, and then churches and their leadership teams. But I think it's time for us to be a lot more thoughtful about how we approach youth ministry, and that's because if we don't, there's some significant trends that are happening in our country that we need to be aware of as Christians. Maybe you're all familiar with the term the nuns. And by nun, I don't mean like Catholic nuns. I'm talking about people who have no religious affiliation. So, different studies, different groups, when they do religious studies, they'll ask people, are you atheist, are you agnostic, are you just like not religiously affiliated? And those people who fall into that general category are growing tremendously in America. Over 20%, somewhere 23%, almost a quarter of Americans say they have no religious affiliation. Whether they're atheist or agnostic, or they just don't really feel like they fit into any box. And that group is growing, and that group is pretty powerful in the younger ages, the younger generations. Another thing just to be aware of is that 70% of young adults drop out of church. 70%. Now, you'll hear that number a little higher, 86%, but Ed Stetzer, who's worked with Lifeway Research, an article of his I read said it's more like 70% of young adults drop out of church. But the point is, lots of them do. Lots of young adults drop out of church. Now, eventually, many of them come back, but starting at age like 15, 16, students really start to disengage from our churches, and we want to figure out why. And so that's why I think I want to start with talking about the goal of youth ministry, the goal of youth ministry. Now, the first thing I want you to understand is don't miss the point of youth ministry. When it comes to youth ministry, we're talking about focusing on ministering to specifically junior high and high school students, and I know some variation, junior high, high school, different states have, high school starts in 9th grade or 10th grade, or, do you consider 6th graders to be junior high, or even 5th graders, but I'm mainly thinking of junior high, high schoolers in this presentation, though, like I said, it applies to a lot of other age groups as well. But let's first talk about what youth ministry is not, or how you know if you're kind of missing the point of youth ministry. Now, when I say youth group or youth ministry, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? The first thing that pops in your head? For me, I remember visions of like broom ball. I don't know if anybody remembers what broom ball is. Broom ball, when I was a kid, I said this to a group of like 20-somethings, and they'd never heard of broom ball. But that's like when I was a kid, we would like go to an ice rink in the middle of the night, and like we would pay for it. We wouldn't like break into it. We'd go there in the middle of the night, and you get a ball, and you have broomsticks, and you slide around on the ice, and it's fun. So it's like a game, right? So when you think of youth group, you might think of something like that. You think of all-night video parties in the church. You might think of camp retreats, middle of the night scavenger hunts, see you at the pole rallies. That was a really big deal when I was a student, and still a big deal. And all those things are good. I'm not against those things. I'm not against those issues. But what I would say is that none of those things are the point of youth ministry. All those things are important, but none of those things are the main goal of youth ministry. The goal of youth ministry is not to have really fun events. The main goal of youth ministry is not to have the coolest facility possible. The main goal of youth ministry is not to have even just super really intense retreats. Those are all great things. They're all good things, and they all have a purpose in ministry, and do those kinds of things at our church, but that's not the point. The point of youth ministry is much more specific than that. And this really struck me at Alpine. When I first took over the youth ministry at Alpine, I was brought in because we had a change of leadership. I mean, I was already at the church, but I was overseeing other ministries, and they asked me to take over youth. And I came into the youth group, and the youth group, in a certain level, looked like it was doing really well. There was a pre-existing structure that had worked for a lot of years, and we had a lot of great youth leaders who had done a lot of great things, and we had a pretty large youth group. Our youth group was about 200 students at that time, which is pretty big, and we had a couple dozen leaders. And so the first, I don't know, few weeks, few months, I just had a lot of meetings with youth leaders. And what I found was that we spent all of our time in our youth meetings, which, it's hard to get everyone together, but when we'd have youth leader meetings or when I'd talk to a small group of leaders, we would talk about activities and permission slips and the type of projectors to buy and who gets to choose the worship music and who's going to cut the trash at events, and like that was all we ever talked about. And at a certain point, I just felt like this is not what youth ministry is all about. It's this stuff's all important, all of it needs to get done, but this is not the heart of youth ministry. This is, Jesus didn't commission us to just go make sure we get, we have good projectors in our churches. That's not the mission that Jesus has called us on. So what is the goal of youth ministry? What's the goal? In order to find the goal, we need to go back to the words of Jesus. And what I want to do, I want to look at the Great Commission and youth ministry. So the Great Commission, of course, is found in Matthew 28. Your Bibles, you can open Matthew 28. Verses 18 and 20 are the actual Great Commission. Matthew 28 is a really interesting chapter in the Bible. And I talk a lot just in my preaching and teaching and discipling. I talk a lot to people about the Great Commission. It's a really interesting chapter because really most of Matthew 28 is the resurrection. Jesus is alive, and it talks about all these people who saw the risen Lord, female disciples, and all the people, then the other apostles, and the idea that the soldiers, they witnessed the resurrection, and then the whole plot to keep them keep them quiet. And so all of that's going on in Matthew 28. And then in verse 16, the 11 disciples, they go to Galilee, which Jesus had said to meet Galilee. And so they go to this mountain. And it says there in verse 17, one of the most interesting verses in the Bible, I think. It says, when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Which is kind of interesting, I just think. I'm reading out the ESV translation. And it says there that when they gathered on the mount together, that the 11 disciples, because of course Judas wasn't there, the disciples were there, and some worshipped him, because he's alive now, but some doubted, which is just interesting. And that word out there doesn't mean belief. It means more like hesitancy. They just really weren't sure what to make of it. They were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead, as you probably know. And so some doubted. But then it says Jesus came to them in verse 18, and I have this here on the slides. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now let's just stop right there. Before we go on, we'll go on in just a second, but let's stop there at verse 18. Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. In other words, Jesus is saying, like, you need to listen to me. This is like an attention-getting statement here. He's like, please pay attention. I'm the one who's in charge. You know, this is the risen Lord, the Jesus Christ, the risen Lord. He is in full command. He has overcome death and sin, the power of sin, and all those wonderful things that Jesus did as he triumphed over the sin on the cross. And now he stands in full authority, and he gives this commission to his disciples, and not just those disciples who were there on the mountain, but obviously you and me as well, every Christian since that time. And I just think that it's just really important for us to understand that Jesus is the one who is giving this commission. It's not the great, it's not the great request that Jesus makes. Like if you're not too busy with everything else you have going on in your life, please go and make disciples. No, this is the risen Lord, the creator of the universe, the King, the one who is in charge. He gives us this command. Verses 19 and 20, he says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Now, when we just read that, you probably did not hear the word youth or youth group in those words, right? And unless you have a very different translation of the Bible, then we should probably, you could talk about with your cohort leader at the break, but you probably should not have seen the words youth or youth group in that passage. But it's my conviction that the Great Commission really gives us the goal of youth ministry and really just the goal of discipleship, and that the Great Commission is just a really clear picture of what discipleship is all about, that we want to equip our students to be able to obey and follow the Great Commission. And so the goal of the youth ministry, we start off by saying, what is the goal of the youth ministry? And so here's what the goal of youth ministry is. The goal is making the students disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus. Right? What we want to do in youth ministry is we want to help students become disciples who make disciples. So we're not just making disciples, we're making disciple makers. That's the goal. And this is what I find to be in the commission. You know what Jesus said there is, he says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So go out, right? And as it says there, the real verb, or the real idea there is, in your going, as you go out into the world, Jesus is assuming that we're going to go out into the world. The verb there is to go make disciples. Go disciple make is what he's telling us to do. And we do that among all nations, which means, of course, we go to other countries, but it also means in our own communities that we reach out to other ethnicities, other people groups, which living in America in the 21st century, it's much easier for us to be connected to other people groups. We don't have to go too far, although thankfully some of us are still called to go overseas and be missionaries. But go or make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, I think it's really interesting when Jesus talks about baptism there, because the fact that Jesus includes baptism in the discipleship-making process teaches me something pretty profound about discipleship. Because who gets baptized? Right? Who gets baptized? People who people who've just become Christians, typically people who've just become Christians get baptized. Now, sometimes in our churches, someone will get baptized, after they've been a Christian for a lot of years, but typically a person becomes a follower of Jesus, becomes a Christian, and then hopefully pretty soon they get baptized. And what that teaches me, Jesus talks about that really what Jesus is talking about in the Great Commission when he talks about baptism, baptize them and teach them to obey all that I've commanded. Jesus is saying that discipleship involves what we would call evangelism, and then sort of the process of ongoing discipleship and helping people to obey Christ. That really evangelism, a lot of my life, I didn't understand this. I sort of divorced evangelism from discipleship. But what Jesus is saying is when you go out into the world to make disciples, you need to start with people who are not yet Christians. You need to find people who are not yet Christians. And part of discipling is evangelizing them, telling them about the gospel, preaching the gospel to them, sharing the gospel with them, living out the gospel with them, and once they accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, to be baptized. I think that's really important, that when we talk about youth ministry, what we're doing more specifically is, number one, we want to help students trust in Jesus and honor God with their lives. That the idea of baptism is coming to that faith moment where they put their faith in Christ. That is embedded in the Great Commission. That discipleship starts. You can disciple someone who's not yet a Christian. I mean, currently right now, I am prayerfully discipling several people who are not yet Christians, who I've begun to share the gospel with them. My wife and I, we're actively talking to them about God, but they're not yet Christians. But we want to bring them to that point where they follow the Lord in baptism. And so we really see that as part of the discipleship process. When it comes to student ministry, we want to help students trust in Jesus and honor God with their lives. Because what did Jesus say there in verse 20? He says, teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. Teach them, when you make a disciple, you need to teach them to obey all that Jesus has commanded. Does that sound hard to anyone? That sounds really, because I know about you. Well, I know about you. I know that you don't do this perfectly either. I know that about. I've never met you, and I'm not trying to pick on you, but look, I don't obey everything Jesus commanded perfectly either, and so my process of sanctification is ongoing. So is yours. But when it comes to student ministry, what we're trying to do is we're trying to see students come to Christ. We want to see students put their faith in Jesus. And this means that the goal of youth ministry isn't simply to help all the kids within the church grow in their faith. Some churches will have a youth group where pretty much every kid in there is already a Christian, which is praise God for that. But we still have a responsibility that there's probably students in our church who aren't going to youth group. Realistically, I think most of us, even if you have a youth ministry, you're going to have students in your youth ministry who really aren't Christians. They may say they're Christians, they may know the right lingo because their parents are Christians, but there's a good chance that some of them don't really have an authentic relationship with Jesus. And so we want to make sure that they really trust in Jesus as their Savior, that they really understand the gospel. Secondly, we want to reach out to students who aren't part of the youth group, and we don't really know where they're at spiritually. And there's a good chance that you have a number of students connected to your church through parents or grandparents who haven't yet put their faith in Jesus. And then also what we want to do, we want to train our students and we want to train our leaders to reach out to the students in our community, to reach out to students in junior high and high schools, reach out to students on their sports teams or in band with them, or just friends, neighborhood kids that they play video games with all night. Whatever. We want to help our students be evangelistic, and we need to be evangelistic in youth ministry. We can't lose sight of that. That youth ministry is not just inward focused, but it's outward focused. Like just about every aspect of our church, at some level, should be outward focused, trying to see people come to Christ. And so we want to see students put their faith in Jesus, trust in Jesus. We also want to see them honor God with their lives, which, again, that is a lifelong process, right? It's a lifelong process to honor God with your life. But that's what we have a responsibility to do with our students, to help them grow in obedience to Christ, to help them grow in understanding of the Bible. It's what the Bible's all about. I'm a big believer with kids. one of the best things you can do with kids, especially if you're mom and dad, particularly if you're mom or dad, is to just help the kids understand the story of the Bible. Just what's the Bible all about? That's why I love stuff. I know this isn't a kids mystery training, but I love, the Jesus Storybook Bible, something like that tells the whole story of the Bible, and so from a young can do that. And my students to understand sort of the big scope of the Bible. What's the story of the Bible? Where's the Bible going? What's the big picture of it? Have some basic understanding of theology. Want them to grow in prayer. Want them to grow in communion with God. Want them to grow in fighting sin in their lives. We want to be honest with our students, and really when we talk about a discipleship context, a mentoring context, which we're advocating throughout all our day together, it really gives us an opportunity to be real about where we're at, where our students are at, where they're at in their pursuit of God, and where we can just have real, honest conversations. Just real recently, I had a youth leader just tell me about just some sin he figured out that one of his student leaders was involved in, and he's just kind of like, what do I do? How do I handle this situation? And because they have a strong discipleship, mentoring relationship, I was like, well, you just need to just be honest with this young man, and just lovingly just say, hey, I love you, I care about you, I know that you love Jesus, I know that you want to honor Jesus with your life, so let's talk about why you're just tolerating the sin in your life. Let's deal with it together. And that's what we want to do. We want to help students trust in Jesus. We also want to help them honor God with their lives. And that's really that's part of the discipleship process that Jesus lays out in the Great Commission. But we don't want to stop there. We want to go one step further, and that's the second part of our goal, which is we want to teach students how to make disciples. I don't think everything I've said at this point is controversial. Every youth group I've ever been a part of, every youth group I've ever interacted with, every youth group I've ever heard of, they are all about they're all about evangelism at a certain level. Even if they don't do a great job of it, they have a certain heart for evangelism, and they want to help students. Christians. I mean, what else would you really want to volunteer for youth ministry as an adult if you didn't want to help students grow as followers of Jesus? Because how many of us are really volunteering to stay up all night? I mean, not too many. I got 4 kids. I'm not looking to stay up all night more than I have to. And so it's because we're motivated. We want to see these students grow in their relationship with God. But unfortunately, a lot of youth groups, the majority of youth groups, stop at the point helping students come to Christ and honor God with their lives. That's where they stop. Now, those things are good, but that's not fulfilling the Great Commission. I've had youth groups where we've had students come to Christ, where we had students really grow in their love for God and their love for other people. Every time the youth group got together, there was really good fellowship, there was sweet times of worship, and yet our youth group failed in this key area of teaching students how to make disciples. And so, looking back, I would say, God is so gracious that even when we fail, He's good. But we failed in this area of helping students make disciples, and that's really, I'd say, a hole in a lot of our youth ministries, that we don't challenge our students to lead someone else to Christ. Or even if we challenge them, we don't give them the tools on how to do that. We don't train them on how to do that. We never practically show them how to do that. We don't give students opportunities to mentor kids in our church or other students. But when I read the Great Commission, it's so clear, right? It says, go and make disciples of all nations. And that is not just a command for the 11 disciples. It's not just a command for Christians 2,000 years ago. It's not a command for just pastors or elders. It is a command for all followers of Jesus to go and make more disciples. Once somebody becomes a disciple of Jesus, what they're supposed to do? They're supposed to go make more disciples of Jesus. And I think one of the primary ways that we glorify God is through making disciples. It's an act of worship to make disciples. And, when I read the Great Commission, it doesn't say, well, go make disciples of all nations unless you're under 21. Then don't worry about it. Then just focus on yourself if you're a teenager. No, there's no age limit on this. There's no age minimum, whether you are 2 or 92 or 102, wherever you are. Well, maybe 2 is a little young, okay. But even if you're a kid, right, if you really understand the gospel, in some sense, you can begin to tell other people about Jesus. My kids, a couple of my kids are really invitational. They're really good at inviting their friends to church, and they just really have that heart. I would like to take credit for it, but really it's just God, I think, working in their life, and their mom working in their life, and just showing them, like, hey, being a Christian means helping other people do God too. And so, Jesus says, look, all authority is from me, so now go and make disciples. And that's what we want to do with our students. We want to help them go and make disciples. And this is a big deal. This is a big issue. There's a lot of challenges that come with this, and we're going to really tease out these challenges and stuff. But notice what Jesus says there in verse 20. He says, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So Jesus is with us. Jesus is present with us when we make disciples. Jesus is present with us as we mentor students, as we help students honor God with their lives. And Jesus is present with us as we send students out to make disciples, and we coach them through that process. So, this isn't a hopeless adventure. It isn't like this isn't hopeless. If it was just all up to us to create really slick, impressive discipleship programs, then yeah, that would be a problem. But Jesus, the risen Savior of the world, is with us, and He's on our side. And in my mind, that guarantees that success is going to happen, because Jesus wouldn't commission us, He wouldn't give us His Holy Spirit unless He was going to give us what we need to be successful. Now, success doesn't necessarily mean numerical success like we might dream about. I mean, God has His own plans for each one of our churches and each one of our ministries and each one of our lives. But God is, I do believe that if you really say, okay, God, I want to make disciples, I want to help students make disciples, He's going to honor that request. Now, it's really important that we get this goal of youth ministry. It's so important that we understand this. It's so important that if you're the pastor or an elder who oversees youth ministry, or you're a youth pastor or you're a youth leader, all the youth leaders, it's important that everyone understands that this is the goal of youth ministry. Because what it does is it radically redefines what you do as a youth ministry. And my last point for the session, that the goal of youth ministry will focus our activities. Because we said that a lot of us, well, I said, but I'm hoping you agreed with me, that a lot of us, we tend to think of youth ministry primarily in terms of activities and things we do. But really the goal of youth ministry is, again, to make students disciples, to help students become disciples, make disciples. And if that is our goal, it's radically going to focus the activities of our church. In order to accomplish any mission, you have to have a goal in mind, right? You have to know where you're going. Otherwise, you'll end up with some really weird stuff. I know, this just popped in my head, but like a few years ago, I decided I was going to make a manger for our living room. Like, I don't know, I am not like a carpenter by any means, but maybe I heard someone do that or something, or I think my brother-in-law said he was going to do it, and I was like, well, if my brother-in-law can do it, I'm sure I can do it. And so I decided I was going to make a manger for our living room, and since I'm not a woodworker, I should have put some thought into this and maybe come up with some plans, but I just sort of I saw a picture of what I wanted on the internet, and I was like, I'm just going to do that. And I came up with a very wonky manger that was really large, much larger than what my wife was hoping for, and it kind of displaced our coffee table inadvertently. But and it would not place a baby in the manger that I made. But the point is, I had a mission, but I didn't really have a clear plan of how I was going to get there, and I didn't really have goals along the way to help me get there. I just said, I want to make a manger. And so maybe you say, well, we want to minister to youth. Well, what are we doing here? How are we ministering to youth? Well, what we're doing is what I think we need to do, what I think the Bible makes clear, is we need to make disciple makers out of our students. And that's the great for our youth ministries. So we're going to have some important implications for our youth ministry. In fact, I would just say, to step back, for our entire church at Alpine, our goal is to help people become disciple makers. We want to help people become disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus. And so we're making, maybe making sounds like the wrong word, but we're helping, we're encouraging, we're discipling people to be disciple makers, not to just grow in their own knowledge of God and their own obedience to God, but we're helping them grow as disciple makers. And so for all of our church, for every team, every ministry of our church, that really influences and it really defines what we do. And so the same youth ministry. this has got some important implications for youth ministry. Because if we only have time to do one thing in youth ministry, we're going to focus on helping our students become disciple makers. That's what we decided, that even if we have to suffer in some of our events or in some of our other activities, we are going to help students become disciple makers. And so all of our activities and all of our retreats, they need to serve this larger goal. And so, for our retreats, one of the things that we did a few years ago was for our retreats were, like, and by retreats, I mean like winter retreat or summer retreat, summer camp, winter camp. They were kind of traditional, what I had grown up with, which is you have a speaker, you have some worship and some music and a lot of fun. But one of the things that we did in our retreats a few years ago was we started to, after every message at night and in the mornings, we would have small group time. We would break up all of our youth activities. We would prioritize small group time, and that was a real emphasis throughout the whole camp. That really what the teacher was doing was sort of setting up small group time, so that the teacher wasn't there to just sort of wow all the students with funny stories or an amazing testimony, although maybe that would all happen in the delivery. But at the end of the day, really, it was about setting up the small group. Why? Because in the small group, we could get closer to making disciples. We could have real, honest conversations. We could just ask the students, did you understand what that lesson was all about? Get it? Lost? And we just have more fruit from that. And, all of our activities, too. Our activities are put through this grid. What is the goal of youth ministry? It's to help students become disciples of Jesus. And, again, part of my understanding of discipleship is that includes evangelism. So if activities are going to be evangelistic in nature, well, that's good. We do them because it will start the process or begin or continue the process of discipleship in a student's life who's not connected to our church. So that's a great thing to do. But if we're going to have an activity just to hang out as a youth group, we might do that, but we're not going to put a lot of resources to it. We're not going to put a lot of money towards it, because that's not, the goal isn't just to hang out and to have fun and to entertain, stuff like that. We're trying to be more purposeful, and sometimes that's hard for parents to understand. Sometimes the parents will say, my kids aren't having fun right now in youth group, and I think, well, I won't tell you what I really. No, I don't. It's not. I get that, right? I get that. My kids are younger. If my kids are teenagers and unhappy with youth group, that would cause panic in my life and in my heart, and so I get that. But the point isn't to have fun. I hope that our students have a lot of fun. I know that they do most of the time, but sometimes there's greater goals. And when your leader confronts you about a sin in your life, that's not a fun moment in your life. And so it's not always going to be about having fun. Not that I'm anti-fun, but if an activity doesn't help us fulfill our goal, or if it drains resources, we're going to get rid of it. And so activities need to be built on how to encourage small relationships, or mentoring relationships, or empowering our students to lead. That's going to inform us of what we do. Now, I just want to go back to what we started with as we wrap up this first session together. We talked about that 70% of students, 70% of young adults are going to fall out of church. They're going to stop going to church at some point. And what was interesting, the same study that by Ed Stetzer that talked about that, it also talked about what was most predictive in keeping kids in the church. Now, there's no like magic formula that will guarantee that your kids will stay in church, or that your students stay connected to Christ, and that they'll keep pursuing Him. But there are several things that go on that will increase the likelihood that your students really stay connected to your youth group. The first was they found that students who stayed through youth group to the end, until 18, they said that they wanted the church to help guide them in decisions in everyday life. So they believed that if the youth group was really helping me navigate my teenage years, really helping me navigate real world decisions about my life, that it was very useful. If they felt that the church didn't help me make decisions for my life, then they could just sort of ignore youth group because it really didn't connect them to where their friends were at in school and whatnot. Another indicator for youth ministry, for success in youth ministry, were that parents were still married to each other and that they both attended church. There's a high correlation to the fact if mom and dad are both Christians, both evangelical Christians, and they both attend church, there's a high likelihood that the students are going to stay connected to the youth ministry. Now, I'll just tell you, I grew up in a single-parent home. I grew up with my mom, and my mom became a Christian when I was in junior high. I was actually a Christian before my mom, and she loved the Lord, and I've pretty consistently attended church from junior high on throughout my life. But one of the greatest indicators for your young adults, your students, connected to church and mom and dad, be followers of Jesus who are actively living out their faith. One of the other things that really keeps students connected to church is the pastor's sermons were relevant to my life. The pastor's sermons were relevant to my life. You know, I think in our church, at least right now, you know, we're always willing to change sort of how we pull off our ministries, and we're always evaluating them. But right now, on Sunday mornings, our youth don't have a youth group. They don't have a Bible study on Sunday mornings. We encourage them to serve in some capacity at church and attend a service. And so that means I'm one of the preachers, teachers at the church, and so that means every Sunday I'm teaching students. And so I have to keep that in mind, that in my messages I have to apply the truth for adults, but I also have to apply the truth for students. And if you don't talk to students in your messages and they're sitting in your congregation, they just think, oh, this church has nothing to do with my life. This is totally irrelevant. So we want to talk to students. And then the last piece, that real indicator that really keeps kids glued to your church, is at least one adult from the church, other than mom and dad, made a significant investment in them personally and spiritually. That somebody in the church, and it does not have to be a pastor. I hope we'll drill down on this in the next session. It doesn't have to be a pastor, but somebody in the church really invested in them, personally and spiritually. And I can think of several people who really invested in me as a teenager in my church, who were not pastors, who were not paid. They were just committed leaders, and they invested in me, and that really made an impact in my life. And so I just wanted to end this session with those factors, those ideas, because to me it just says that what do we have to do in youth ministry? Disciple, disciple, disciple. That's what we got to do. We have to disciple. We have to help students become not just disciples of Jesus, but disciple makers. We help students become disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus, and that's our goal for ministry. It's a very practical goal. I really submit to you that if you understand what the goal of youth ministry is, it will really just change the way you think about youth. It'll change the way you think about your ministry. And I'd even say that if you really see discipleship as a critical function of every ministry of your church, that'll really change the way that you look at all your ministries. And so, I just encourage you. We're going to talk about this in our discussion time, in our question time, but think about the Great Commission and how it connects to every single one of us, how it connects to students, how it connects to parents. What are the implications for us? Because if we get the goal of youth ministry right, you're going to have, I believe that you'll have a successful youth ministry. Now, successful doesn't mean big numbers necessarily, but it means successful. It means that you're going to be pouring into the lives of students and creating students that have the godly virtues and values that Jesus wants them to have. And so that's success, right? It's success because you're honoring God. And then once you understand the goal of youth ministry, you're going to be creating a generation of students who are disciple makers. And think about how that will influence our churches. If students, like starting with our teenagers and our young adults, what if that was the first crop in our churches that really got disciple making, that really understood that the Christian life, it's not about coming to church and hearing music that entertains me, and it's not about hearing a sermon that I find interesting, although I'm a big fan of worship music and I'm a big fan of sermons, but they're like, you know what, really, as a Christian, it's not being a consumer, it's about going out into the world and helping people follow Jesus, and it's about being authentic in my relationship with God and really living to honor and obey Him. I mean, just think about how that would revolutionize and change your church. And I know that's my prayer is that our students in our church are the ones who really understand this and feel this deeply the most, this burden to be disciple makers, because what an awesome future we'll have for our church. And so, don't miss the point of youth ministry. don't get sidetracked by all the busyness, all the stuff that comes up, the permission slips, which are important, all those issues. But think about, okay, what is primary? What matters the most? And then make that your focus. So that wraps up this first session. I think I'm finishing a little bit early, so that wraps up this session, and we can go ahead and transition to the discussion questions now.